Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another Oceans, Forests, Streams video. Today I am going to be building an air plant terrarium that is going to utilize the same large cloche that we used in the last video. If you missed that and you would like to see how that is built, please go check out the Single Orchid Display video. Without further ado, let's get going. For an enclosure like this, I like to think that the most important aspect is the wood. These are manzanita branches that are going to need a little bit of a trim, but they are really sturdy and will hold up the plants extremely well. For the plants, I'm going to be using sheet moss and mood moss. I will discuss those a little bit further. The other type of moss that I'm going to be using is a dusk moss mix. This is a plumosa fern, rabbit's foot fern, and then here are the tillandsias that I'm going to be using. I'm probably not going to use all of them, but I wanted to have a variety of a selection to choose. Like I was saying, the moss is considered sheet moss and mood moss. Both of these are temperate species, so I don't know if the long-term success is going to be good. You can tell this is temperate collected because, of course, of a lot of the pine needles that are found inside the moss, but it should still work. This is called Asparagus plumosa. It's also known as the plumosa fern. It's not really a fern, but it loves high humidity, so it should be great inside this enclosure. These are the only epiphytic plants that I know of besides the tillandsias that we're going to be using in this, which are rabbit's foot ferns. And I think they should look really cool in the bottom. As for the tillandsias, again, these are things that you can find pretty much at any greenhouse nowadays. I'm not entirely sure exactly which species I have here, but if I was to take a guess, I believe that they're either Aeroanthus, bulbosa, stricta, capitata, hericii, and Powerfolia, and I'm not entirely sure exactly if I have those, but I would bet that they at least fall into that category. This is the ultrasonic humidifier that was used in the previous video. You can simply pick these up on Amazon at a reptile supply store, but what I like is it has the tube that I can connect then to a PVC pipe. Of course, the next most important item that you're going to need is the different types of super glue. This is going to be a little comparison between these two brands. Some of the other additional materials that you're going to probably want to get are a container to plant in, some silicone. These are silicone little feet to put under the planter, a bit to drill through ceramics and wood, some washers that go along with stainless steel screws to mount the branches, a Sharpie to mark where you're going to be drilling, a drill to drill, tape measure to measure the height, and these are wood clippers for the manzanita branches. To start off with the construction portion of this, I'm going to break down these manzanita branches into smaller, more manageable pieces. As much as I like the branchy aspect of these end branches, they just are going to be a little bit too cluttered inside the terrarium, really hindering, exactly where we're going to be able to plant certain plants. As you can see from this, the wood is quite strong, so it's nice to get either a great pair of heavy-duty shears, or what I like to use are these bonsai branch trimmers. They have a really nice curved blade to cut into the branch, making a very clean, crisp cut. It's always good that when you're cutting up branches, you have the enclosure that you're going to be putting the branches inside nearby, just so you can measure against it, make sure that they fit properly inside. As you can see, these branches are still going to need a little bit of trimming. Another way that you can measure up against the enclosure is by using a tape measure. And even though certain cloches especially are going to be labeled as a 20 inch, more likely they're going to be an inch off or so. You can also determine where exactly you're going to want to cut certain branches off to fit in a little better, and exactly how much you're going to be losing at the base of the branch. After you've put it next to your cloches, you can then decide exactly which further cuts you need to make. I also like to hold on to all the branches after I've done clipping. You never know exactly when you're going to need to mount some other moss or something on those branches. When it comes to cutting the base of the branch, I like to first mark exactly where I'm going to be cutting, and use either a really nice sharp hand tool, or in this case, a miter saw. You do want to have a nice clean cut, very flush on the bottom for the next step. This is probably the most dangerous part of the build, and that's drilling in the pilot into manzanita. The manzanita branches are extremely hard, which means you're going to need a sharp bit, and I like to measure off the bit exactly how far you need to drill into the wood. As you can see, I am hand holding this. There's really no other way to do it. Just recommend that you get your palm out of the way. Here is what can happen when you don't properly line up the branch. And you can see I bust out, not once, but I try to clear it out, drill again, and bust out the other side. And that's why you want to keep your palm away from the drill. Even though we measured against the top of the cloche, we still need to see what it's going to look like on the base. I always like to dry place them just on the base, line them up, make sure that they fit properly. If there is overhang, it is going to collide with the glass of the cloche, so it's just nice to make sure that everything kind of fits within that 10-inch base. After we have measured against the side of the base or the side of the bottom, I like to mark exactly where I'm going to need to drill through the ceramic material. Although it isn't a requirement with ceramic, I do like to add water before I start drilling, just to help add a little bit of lubricant. And this is a masonry hole bit. You can find this at any hardware store. It is what's used to drill inside glass or ceramic. The technique that I like to utilize is starting at a 45-degree angle and then turning the drill up to a 90-degree while keeping it perpendicular to the base. It's never a bad idea that halfway through drilling, you add a little bit more water just to help guide the bit through. Now that you're comfortable drilling the first hole, the second hole should actually go quite a bit easier. After you get your holes drilled, it's nice to just double check and make sure that the screws that you got fit. These are stainless steel machine screws. I like them because the heads are a little bit more flat. They're not going to take up a lot of space. I add silicone to the bottom of the branches just to help secure them to the base after they've been screwed. And here's what you should end up with, a very sturdy branch structure that you can then plant on. Just need to make sure that everything fits in the base. Right here I'm marking another hole where I have the PVC pipe coming through the bottom of the base. This hole is going to be a little bit different. As you can see, I'm using a 1-inch drill bit. This particular bit is going to be a little bit harder to find. However, it's not necessary unless you feel like you need to have your pipe work come through the base. I do like to use water with a hole this size. It's no longer a suggestion. I would say it's mandatory to help prevent any cracking. After the hole's drilled, it's just nice to double check and make sure that your pipe work fits relatively well inside the hole. It's not going to be perfect, but since you're siliconing it in, it's not going to be that big a deal. For this, I don't need to worry too much if the silicone looks good. It is going to get covered with soil. The only thing that you're going to see is just the very top lip of the PVC pipe. Now all we have to do is let it dry. Because we're not going to be watering this directly, we're going to be using mist to water. The soil isn't as important. All the plants that I'm utilizing, with the exception of the asparagus plumosa, is epiphytic, which means that they, of course, are getting water and nutrients from the air instead of the soil. This soil is just a recycled soil from the potted plants themselves, some charcoal, some reptile soil, and some aquarium soil. So it's, like I said, it's not really that big of a deal. You can use simple potting soil or terrarium soil just fine. Just something that you can keep the ambient humidity a little bit higher. I like to break up my plantings with odd numbers of plants. Even though in the long run you're probably not going to tell that there are multiple plants in there as they grow into one another, but at the early stages it's nice to have that separation just to kind of help make it seem a little bit more natural, not so balanced. I'm going to be adding a few river rocks just to help add a little bit of separation between the next soil layers. This is going to add some height to the terrarium, making an otherwise flat base into something a little bit more dynamic. Here I am using that sheet moss. Even though I don't have long-term high hopes for it, I think it will add a little bit of humidity. It will help retain humidity inside the terrarium, and that's going to go the same for the mood moss. I've never really had success with it. There are companies that do claim that it's live, it should survive as long as you give it adequate lighting, adequate water, humidity, but never really had it last longer than maybe at most 6 months. Which is a shame, because I mean it's really cool. It's a really cool plant. I think that the structures in the club moss, or the structures in the mood moss and the sheet moss really have a nice contrast to one another, and it's just something that I wish that we had a tropical representation of. To compensate for it not lasting so long, I am going to be using that slurry mix that you saw at the beginning to help fill in the gaps that I will inevitably have with the moss down the road. And just like in an aquarium planting, you want to make sure that you have your tall plants in the back. That doesn't obstruct the view from the foreground. I am a little concerned that these plumosa ferns are going to outgrow this enclosure really quick, but it's a problem that I'm just going to have to deal with down the road. As you can see, it's just a nice little grove in the back. It will fill in over time. These haven't even started branching out, but once the plumes start happening, I think it's going to look really cool. So here's the completed terrestrial part of the enclosure. I like to make sure that it gets a really nice mist of water, and this is RODI water, on all the plants just to keep the humidity up as I move on to planting the upper portion of the terrarium. The biggest problem with air plants is that they were growing in the air prior to being collected or harvested. That means generally that they're not going to be growing ideally for how you want to position them. Yeah, I think I'm going to probably be using the smaller one in the front. Here's the first brand of super glue that I'm going to use. I don't have high hopes for it. I prefer to use something like a gel super glue. This seems a little bit too watery. Even though it is a gel formula, it doesn't seem like it's going to hold as well. And you will be able to tell I struggled quite a bit trying to mount just this one plant. So even though it's not sticking exactly well, I do like to use water to help kind of set the super glue, make it a little bit more tacky to see if that will help. That brand didn't work so well, so I'm going to move on to the next one, which is a thicker gel formula. I really do think this one is going to work. I've used this in the past with other projects that involve living things. Don't worry, it sounds worse than it actually is. But this one, yeah, this formula actually did seem to work quite well. With the help of water, it definitely does help activate that super glue, just to help it get a little bit more tacky so that the plant sticks a little bit easier. This section of the terrarium is the closest to the glass, so I want to make sure that the plant that's here grows away from the glass. While that most likely is going to be impossible to judge exactly how it grows, because it is a cloche design, I'm hoping that surrounded by light, it's not going to grow directly into the glass. As we get higher in the terrarium, we are going to be able to use some larger tillandsias. It has been said that the ones that are more silver or covered heavier in the trichomes are ones that are found higher up in the branches. The trichomes seem to act as a sunscreen, protect the leaves from that high intensity ultraviolet radiation. Even though I feel like I could put some larger plants in this section, I ultimately decided that it was going to be too much visual weight up top, so I decided to just go with another small air plant. You do see pictures of air plants in the wild growing directly on small branches. However, just to make it easier on me, I thought it was best to just use the little nooks and crannies in between branches to anchor the plants, and that's where I ended up gluing most of them. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you felt like you learned something, feel free to hit the thumbs up, the subscribe button, and ring that notification bell. I hope you all have a great week. I'll see you next time.